This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm so pleased to be able to be a part of this conversation. Our panelists this afternoon represent government, religious, and civic institutions that are really key players in efforts to identify and combat human trafficking and to address its harms, both in the US and around the world. So I hope we'll have a chance to talk today about some of the issues at stake and how we identify and define human trafficking, as well as how religious communities understand their distinctive roles in addressing trafficking and related issues. But first, let me briefly introduce our panelists, and you have fuller biographies in the program book. Since 2009, Ambassador Luis Sedabaca has coordinated U.S. government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery. He serves as the senior advisor to the Secretary and directs the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Sister Marlene Weisenbeck is a member of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. She is former president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious and served on the White House Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships from 2012 to 2013. She convenes the La Crosse Area Task Force to eradicate modern slavery. Jeff Shaw is the director of Out of Darkness, the anti-trafficking arm of the Atlanta Dream Center. And Aliyah El-Sawi is a victim assistance specialist for immigration and customs enforcement, Homeland Security investigations based in Atlanta. She has responsibility for Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So I'd like to begin just by asking each of you to describe briefly your engagement with the issue of human trafficking and the work of your office or organization. And I'm interested in the context of your work. How do you define and understand human trafficking? I think in popular usage, this term is used to describe a really amazing range of conditions and situations and harms, and people use a number of other terms somewhat interchangeably with human trafficking. So I'm interested in how you identify and define human trafficking in your work, whether there are other terms that you regularly use in talking about the same kinds of situations and phenomena, and are there terms that you do not use or that you would like to see people stop using in relationship to these issues? So what are the factors in determining how you talk about it?
Well, I think that, first of all, this is going to sound like a misnomer, considering that my title is I'm Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, but in some ways I actually think that the word trafficking itself is one of the things that we have to interrogate. 20 years ago I started working on my first slavery case in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida of Guatemalan and Mexican men who were enslaved in fields that we had, as the Justice Department, done cases on 20 years before with African-American victims who were in sharecropping and debt bondage. And this was just kind of the normal work of the Civil Rights Division, police brutality and racial violence and slavery. And so I became the Involuntary Servitude and Slavery Coordinator, which had been the renaming of that back in the 1940s from the peonage program, because peonage is a legal concept that required debt, and Southern U.S. attorneys were turning down cases when there wasn't a debt, when there was just flat-out force, fraud, or coercion being used to hold people in slavery. And so that was the work that we did in the 1990s, and we went to Congress and we asked for an update to those post-Civil War slavery statutes, and the price of admission to some degree was the word trafficking. Because of the movement of folks fleeing the wreckage of the former Soviet Union, the dominant form of enslavement in Europe in the mid to late 1990s was Eastern European women in prostitution, enslaved in prostitution. And the term, dating back to the 1880s, that describes women being moved across international borders or state lines for prostitution, that term has historically been trafficking. If you go even one more euphemism out, it's called white slave trafficking, although it's simply ostensibly just looking at prostitution. So this notion of the term for migrant prostitutes becomes grafted onto the desire of the Justice Department and the advocates to have an update of the post-Civil War slavery statutes, so that we could incorporate in all of the things that we were learning in the women's movement, whether it was battered women syndrome, whether it was differential in power, whether it was Stockholm syndrome or other things like that. All of the psychological manipulation was unavailable to us because of a Supreme Court case from the late 1980s. And so that was the fix for that case. But the price of admission, as I said, kind of was the word trafficking. So from one Friday to following Monday in the first year of the Bush administration, I went from being the involuntary servitude and slavery coordinator to being the human trafficking coordinator. And other than my business cards, nothing changed. I think, though, that what did change is every conversation we've had to have since then has had to say, human trafficking, it's a euphemism for slavery, as opposed to before, which was slavery, it still exists. So I'd like to get us back to that, when we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment this coming February, that is what we do. The law that you mentioned, the TVPA of 2000, was passed under Congress's constitutional ability to enforce the 13th Amendment. That was the basis for that law. And so it is a slavery law, pure and simple. And I think President Obama has said it about as squarely as you could, and the Faith-Based Council did as well, which is, let's just call this what it is. It's modern-day slavery. Sister Marlene?
Yes. I represent the United States Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and we were formed out of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious resolution to make human trafficking a focus in our work in our justice programs. When I was appointed to the Faith-Based Council for the Advisory Council, we were asked to study the topic, and we were asked, it was indicated to us that we should study modern slavery. If you recall, that was in about September 2012, and President Obama was celebrating in a speech, I believe, with the Clinton Initiative, the abolition of the Emancipation Proclamation. So our group goes with the legislation that uses the words force, fraud, and coercion. We find that the word modern slavery seems to have more impact on people. Sometimes it's rejected because it sounds, too harsh perhaps, or we don't want to believe what is happening in our midst. And we tend at times to call ourselves abolitionists, and we think that even that sometimes turns people away, makes them shy about what's happening because they are not aware as they ought to be of what's really happening in our midst. So basically, we use the terms of the legislation.
Good afternoon. Out of Darkness, our mission is to reach, rescue, and restore victims of commercial sexual exploitation. So that's the term we use, commercial sexual exploitation. And what we do in our reach is we go out on the streets here in Atlanta on a weekly basis, and we take roses to women that are working hotels and truck stops and parking lots. And we just take a message that's different from what they've been hearing. We tell them, you're loved, you're beautiful. There are people who are thinking about you and who care about you. And if you ever want out of this situation, there is a way. That's one thing we do. Another thing we do is go into the jails, and there's so many pieces of this that we could break down, but these women, whether you call them trafficking victims or women in prostitution, they're in and out of the justice system often, and there's no fault to attribute there. Law enforcement is doing their job. They're on the streets. They see a crime being committed. They make the arrest. It's not their job necessarily in that moment to get to the bottom of it. People like Aaliyah are doing a great job of changing the conversation and helping understand those back factors. But so a lot of these women are ending up in jail. So we said, hey, why don't we start going into the jails? We're in 6 of them now. And we meet specifically with women who have a history of, we just call it prostitution because they don't call it trafficking. If you talk to a woman who's been in the world, we call it the life, for 3 decades and you say, hey, are you a victim of sex trafficking? She doesn't even know what that means. And so we say, hey, have you ever been in prostitution? Have you ever had to sell your body to get drugs or an apartment or food? Basically anything that is a form of what we would consider sexual exploitation. There's an exchange of money for sexual favor. Then we will visit with her until she's released, and upon her release, we'll bring her into our program. We have a 24-hour, we call it a rescue hotline. I could go way down that road too, because a lot of people cringe when I say the word rescue. For us, a rescue is anytime there's a person in a situation that they are helpless to leave on their own, and they cry out for help, and we extend the hand to help them out, we call that a rescue. You may not like it. We understand the controversy around it, but it's basically just saying, yes, that person made the cry for help. We responded to the cry. They couldn't get out on their own. So they can call this hotline 24 hours a day. We send a team, man and a woman, to pick her up wherever she is and then bring her into our safe homes. If it's an unsafe situation, we call our friends. They let them go do the law enforcement work and secure the scene. We're not vigilantes. We don't carry weapons. We're just there to provide victim support services. So on the back end, we have 3 safe homes that we operate. We have 14 beds available at a time, and in that process, we provide case management, medical attention, things we take for granted, like helping that woman sleep at night, be awake during the day, eat 3 healthy meals, feel the love of a new family, which chances are she's never experienced, or it's been years since she's had any sense of that. So back to the terminology. For us, it's tricky because when you try to get support, community support or financial support around what you're doing, the hot term is sex trafficking, and people perk up when they hear sex trafficking or slavery. But when they hear the stories that we share, not a lot of detail, but what we can to protect the identity, they say, well, that doesn't sound like sex trafficking to me. It sounds like you're just talking about a prostitute. So the story I always tell, and please stop me when I'm going too long, and you can jump in, but the really brief story that we use to illustrate whether we classify someone as a trafficking victim or a woman in prostitution may just depend on how much of her story we actually know. So when we go out on Friday night, we run into an 18-year-old. She's dressed the part. We don't see a person standing 5 feet away with a gun in their belt. We pull up, we offer her a rose and a handwritten card with our hotline number in it. She takes the rose, throws it violently into the bushes. We say, all right, I guess she's a prostitute. She's out here because she wants to be. Well, she calls us the next day, urgent, and says, hey, y'all gave me a rose last night. I threw it in the bushes because my pimp was behind the grocery store across the street watching me. And while I threw the rose in the bush, I tucked your number into my shirt and I called the first chance I got. So we talked to her. She says, this guy started dating me. He met me at the mall. I'm a single mom. I've got a 2-year-old son. He came to my home. He met my son. And then he took me out to a parking lot. He had already lined up clients for me. After he got me drunk, he took my driver's license away and said, this is not your name anymore. He gave me a street name, and he pushed me out the car and told me not to come back until I earned my first $100. So she brings back the money to him, but she keeps back some of it for herself so she can hop on a bus the first chance she gets. And he puts a bag over her head, drives her out into the woods, and says, if you ever short me my money again or if you ever try to leave, I'll bury you in these woods. So for all of us as a culture, a society, we see her on the corner and we say prostitute, but in reality, under the federal legal definition of trafficking, she is a trafficking victim. And so when you talk about prostitution, people aren't inclined to become compassionate or want to help, but the lines that we try to draw, particularly saying choice, did she make a choice? If so, she's a prostitute. If not, she's a sex trafficking victim, implies alternatives, and it discounts the factors that led to that perceived choice. And so last thing I'll say, the analogy that I use about choice is if I see somebody jump out of a 30-story building to their death, I would say that was a poor choice. But if what I didn't know is that building was on fire and the option was to burn alive in the fire or jump out of the building, then it looks a lot less like a choice, right? So I'm done. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I have a little bit to echo of what each of these wonderful panelists have already said, especially Ambassador DeBaca, because we both represent the federal government. So in terms of our definition, we go by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the federal definition that was established back in 2000. So that is used as our guideline and the parameters that we stick within when we conduct investigations, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And the main point about that is that it uses the three elements that were mentioned already before: force, fraud, and coercion. So when we take a case and we present it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, they look for those three elements. And again, whether it's a labor trafficking case or a sex trafficking case. My office, we investigate labor, sex trafficking cases, foreign-born nationals, meaning individuals that came into the United States. A lot of times they may be undocumented. We work with adults, minors, domestic trafficking victims as well. Actually, there was a recent one in which we utilized Out of Darkness's services. And by domestic trafficking, we mean that they are U.S. citizens that are trafficked here within the United States. So that's mainly what my office works with in terms of different definitions or different terms that we've heard being used. You'll notice that Jeff was referring to CSEC, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. That's one term you'll hear a lot. You'll also hear DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking. You'll hear modern-day slavery, which was also another one that was mentioned, indentured servitude, human trafficking. At the end of the day, I think that we look at it as was already mentioned before, as a modern form of slavery. Our office, we actually have a campaign. It's called the Blue Campaign, and it's a campaign that we launched about 3 years ago, in which our entire agency, all of Department of Homeland Security, so that's not only my office, which is the investigative entity, but Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol, FEMA, Secret Service, all of those agencies, we take a collaborative response to promoting awareness surrounding this issue. With our cases, we like to take a victim-centered approach, and we recognize that being ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that sometimes that may not bode well with not only the public, because they automatically think that because we are ICE, that if we find someone that has entered the United States illegally, that our main objective is to deport them. While my office is not part of the detention and deportation, we're just solely based on investigations, I would like to mention that that is a myth. So if there is someone that's undocumented, a foreign national that's in this country that's been forced in, call it what you want to, modern-day slavery, human trafficking, if they're an adult or minor, they are eligible for resources to remain here in the United States. And part of my job is to actually link those individuals with those resources, with organizations like Out of Darkness and other social service organizations, counseling services, shelter, any type of holistic services or needs that that individual may have. I hope to be able to share a little bit more about the immigration relief and the resources as we go on with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's fair to say that religious communities have been very key actors in raising the visibility of human trafficking in the last decade. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and you've already started to talk a little about, how you work with religious communities, and do you think that religious communities have a distinctive role to play in addressing this issue? And what does that role look like? And I guess one of the things I'm curious about is whether you see that role changing over time what kinds of novel approaches do you see religious communities taking to this issue, or what new things are you seeing that are maybe surprising and maybe different from what we were seeing 5 or 7 or 10 years ago?
Start down there and come down. Come this way.
Sure. One of the most recent initiatives we had was actually with the White House committee, faith-based committee, and so we were trying to meet with different individuals throughout the community, throughout various faith-based community members, and try to set up trainings. It was kind of going to be more like a train the trainer. So basically, we would sit down at the table with leaders from various faith-based communities and explain to them a little bit about trafficking, a little bit about how we're trying to take an approach in promoting awareness, and have them as leaders of that community basically take it back into their communities. And so we figured that would be a better approach rather than us, government members coming in and training the community members directly. They may take, I guess the community members may look at it a little bit differently, hearing from someone that is, a prominent figure within their community. So that's one initiative that we currently have going on. I do have to say, with our faith-based organizations in general, we rely on them tremendously. And let me say this, we work with non-faith-based social service organizations, but we also work with faith-based organizations because we recognize that the victims that we serve, a lot of them come from very different backgrounds, different cultures, different religious beliefs. So we don't want to assume that, A, that individual does want to work with a faith-based organization, nor do we want to assume anything about their culture or religion. And what I mean by that is, say, for instance, we have a survivor from El Salvador. I don't want to assume that because she's Latina that she's going to be Catholic, therefore put her in touch with a Catholic organization. We feel like it may be somewhat, I don't want to say re-traumatizing, but we want to be able to give them that choice. And we find that a lot of the survivors actually do feel comfort in reaching out and working with organizations that have the faith-based component. One quick example, we had a labor trafficking case. It was a domestic servant, and this was years ago. She came to the United States. She knew that she was going to work as a nanny, and that was it. She was just, her only duty was to look after this 4-year-old. When she came to the United States, things changed. She was practically treated as an animal. She was made to sleep out in the garage. They made her shave her hair because they figured she was being too, if they let her have her hair and put on makeup and whatnot, that she'd be considered high maintenance. Food that had gone bad was the only access to food that she had, so she would constantly get sick, and they would actually make her eat her own vomit because she had created a mess. She had terrible living conditions. She was made to, rather than being allowed to use the lawnmower to cut the grass, she was made to get on her knees and actually cut the grass with scissors. And so this just kind of shows you what kind of life she had while she was working as a domestic servant. She had no communication with her family or the outside community. She was never allowed to leave the house. Any phone calls that she was allowed to make were supervised. But she finally mustered up the courage in the middle of the night to run away. She'd been packing her bag every night for 2 months, over the span of 2 months. And she would get too scared to actually run away. And then finally she mustered up the courage to run away by calling a taxi that came and picked her up. Well, she never told the taxi driver where she was going, so he drove her around for a while, and eventually he asked her, he said, ma'am, do you have a place that you're going? She had nowhere to go, and so she looked up and she saw that there was a church. She recognized that it was a church because of the cross on top, and so she felt comfortable reaching out to that church. She went to the church. The reverend of that church had actually received training from a local social service provider, Tapestry, and they immediately called their hotline, saying, we just had this woman come in frantically, and we think she may be exploited. And through that, they ended up calling our office. We conducted a joint investigation with the FBI, and we were able to assist her and link her to resources. But all that is to say that that initiative, that collaboration was already established and in the works because we reached out to our faith-based partners. Had that reverend never received human trafficking training, she probably wouldn't have not known which way to direct this victim. But I think that through training, through awareness, and through our partnerships that we build with various faith-based providers, I think that that's really a key to our success and to getting all of the victims that we can out of harm's way. And there are many more stories, but I'll let a lot of the other panelists share that.
So I think there's three roles that the faith community plays. One is in the motivation of the caregiver. So for organizations like Out of Darkness, the people who are coming to us saying, I want to be a part of what you're doing, are saying, there's something related to my faith or my understanding of God and his character that compels me and gives me a joy to serve others who are not as fortunate as I am. So for me, and I can't help but blend me into this because it's me, but I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. And so when I look at his teaching, I look at the fact that he said, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you house the homeless? Did you visit those in jail? And I'm saying, man, if that is what characterizes a follower of Jesus, and I claim to be a follower of Jesus, then I want to do these things. And when I do them, it's not just out of compulsion or obligation. It's a great joy and fulfillment to my life to be reaching out to those who are where I was. I wasn't trafficked, but we've all been in a situation where we needed somebody else to step out of their own area or their own comfort zone and help. And so for me, the motivation of what I do and the motivation for my staff is our faith. For one thing, one of my heroes is William Wilberforce, and William Wilberforce helped end the slave trade in England. And he spent decades fighting it from a policy and reform standpoint. But the thing that gets overlooked is he said the second part of his life's goal was to transform the hearts of men. And so from that perspective, when you're talking about the demand, and for us, sex trafficking, when you're talking about men who have sex addictions, who are pedophiles or child molesters, or they're purchasing sex with women, the people who perpetuate these crimes that we're talking about, it's not enough to say we can just lock them all up, because the reality is it's not 5 perverts that are hiding out somewhere. It's very ingrained in our culture. And there was a study here in Georgia. There's a lot of questions about how it was done, but basically they set up false advertisements for sex, and then through the course of the phone conversation, they would give warnings that the person the individual was calling about might actually be under the age of 18, going from, well, would you be, I can't guarantee, I'm not positive that they're 18, to they may not be 18, to I'm pretty confident they're not 18, and the callers were persisting through that. And out of 7,200 men that they estimate were calling just within the city of Atlanta to purchase sex from women, almost half of those men were persisting through all those questions to still be interested, and 40+% were coming from the suburbs. So when we just say this is just a group of men who are just chemically imbalanced, and if we find them, get them off the street, we have to change our understanding culturally of sexuality and of the value of human dignity and human life. And for us as a faith community, we say that comes through the fact that we recognize every human being as being made in the image of God. And so what we call that Imago Dei, what we recognize as Imago Dei is that every human being has inherent worth and value. And we want to, within our culture, bring about a change that changes the way men who would be sexual perpetrators view those women and girls, to satisfy their own desires in an instant gratification sort of way. So we get really big on the pornography issue too. I won't go down that road, but it's linked. It's all linked. And it's all linked to the conditioning of the brain and how men see women. So the last thing is, with dealing with the survivors themselves, is if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basically on the ground level, you say you've got to meet the immediate needs for shelter, for food, for warmth, for safety. But going up the chart, all of us as human beings at some point in time ask the question, what am I here for? Why have I gone through what I've gone through? What is my life about? And we believe as a faith community, if somebody asks that question, we can share, well, let me tell you what my journeys looked like, but understanding not everybody's going to share that. We have women who come in our home who say, I hate God. I never want to hear his name. Don't ever talk to me about him. Don't ever pray with me. And we honor that. It's a voluntary program. It's not you got to come in and say a prayer or pledge your allegiance to a particular religious viewpoint. We will serve anyone and everyone in need. Our hope is just that we would live lives such that the overflow of our faith is expressed in meeting the immediate physical needs of human beings who've been through this oppression. So I know I've kind of jumped all around, but as much as you can package up that question really tight, those are the three areas I would mention.
Thank you.
Well, as Jeff has eloquently indicated through the practice of their anti-trafficking efforts, it's truly appropriate for faith-based groups to be involved in the abolition of slavery, because almost every religion has some doctrinal statements about the inherent human dignity of every person. And as the Catholic Church would say, or as all of our Christian churches and others would say, we would implement that based on the Beatitudes in the Gospel. As far as women religious are concerned, we work together through our national conferences on resolutions about combating human trafficking, but then also have regional structures where that is implemented. I would say from my experience working at the national level of women religious as well as regional, that when we take these ideas home to our local levels, wherever we are, we would contact our diocesan offices of social justice and ministries. I think that happens in a lot of religious groups, churches as well. I heard that from all of the other members that worked on the National Advisory Council. And then even further down at the ground level, I would say we do a whole lot more in ecumenical coalitions and partnerships than we do just through one faith group by itself. And we're involved in advocacy and awareness issues primarily, working on legislation in our local areas, but also on Capitol Hill, and in training as many people as possible. I'd also say, though, that women religious, I think, are currently running 11 or 12 safe houses here in the United States among, I don't remember the total number. There was a recent study. How many?
Very few.
Well, in the 30s, I think, in the 30s. So that effort is also growing among women religious. As for novel ideas and approaches, I could probably give you about 10, and some of them are very homey examples, and others, seem to have a certain prestige to them when you think of things being done on a national or international level. For example, in the UK, there's the Madai Trust, which is a charity trust founded by sisters, Catholic sisters, brothers, and priests with the aim of helping those who have been trafficked. The U.S. Catholic Sisters group here in the United States represents hundreds, literally hundreds, of congregations of women religious, and we are forming an underground railroad. Many of our congregations sponsor healthcare institutions and universities, so that if one congregation doesn't have the possibility of helping a victim medically or in their educational needs, we're going to find a way through our congregations to make that happen when we know that we're working with one or other victim in our safe houses. Now here's a real homey example coming from Appleton, Wisconsin. I talked to the head of the coalition there, and she was giving a training session, information session to the Women's Knitting Club. And at the end of it all, the women said, well, what can we do? Many people feel very helpless. And they had just discovered that in their free shopping guide in Appleton, weekly, there was a page and a half of advertisements from and to prostitutes for this kind of service. And so she said, what you can do is go to Woodman's, go to the gas stations, go wherever these free ad papers are distributed, gather them up and burn them. And are they ever an active group? Another effort I think that's made primarily by quite a few women's and men's congregations of religious is they connect their investments with human trafficking. For example, they will see that in their portfolios they do not own any stock with companies that are known to have been involved in human trafficking. It takes quite a bit of research to find that out, but they do that. And sometimes, though, the congregations will deliberately also own stock in these companies so that together they can raise an objection and change the habits of those companies. I think that's known to be fairly creative, and also schools, hospitals will be making sure that school uniforms are not made by any company that is known to use trafficked persons. Hotels now sign agreements to train all of their employees to recognize the signs of human trafficking. In my own hometown, I was featured at halftime at a roller derby to talk about human trafficking and the efforts of our local organization. Any and every opportunity, I think, is worth it. And I believe it's tomorrow that the Vatican cricket team and the Anglican team are sparring off with one another on behalf of the Global Freedom Network at Lord's in London, and this is to raise awareness about human trafficking. So I'm just amazed always at how creative people can be, how novel they can be to bring about awareness about human trafficking.
I think that some of these things are so interesting because everybody is coming to this and having that personal moment where they have the realization that this is happening, but then also there's that, okay, and then what do I do? As opposed to simply, oh, this is happening and that's horrible, and now back to our regular programming. I think that one of the things that we've seen on that is that, though, that it really is building on things that people may have forgotten. We are talking about a very different type of slavery here because of the fact that we're talking about modern slavery. Under the federal definitions, under the global definitions, that notion of this is not kidnapping. This is not, oh, you were taken from your home in some other country and brought here to work as a prostitute, or you were taken from your home in another country and brought here to work as a domestic servant or a farm worker. It's very much, you are a farm worker and your boss is not letting you leave and go get another job somewhere. You thought that being a domestic servant was a good opportunity for you and now you can't get out. Regardless of whether or not somebody got into prostitution seemingly willingly or seemingly through force. If you've got a pimp who's using control over them, then we need to react accordingly. And that's under the law. I think that we all would agree that we have to figure out a way to act compassionately towards that person, regardless of whether they fit a legal definition, because our legal definitions are not that person's life. They are simply how the government is going to interact with them as far as the legal system, et cetera. I think that that's where the morality that the faith-based community brings in, the notion of both as groups, big groups, whether we say faiths or different organizations within those different faiths or ecumenical partners, but each of those then ends up translating itself by the individuals within them. A few years ago, the truck that I think it's been through, it was over the Carter Center a few years ago, the Modern Slavery Museum truck from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, literally a rider truck that is the same model that a number of their members were held in at night, locked up by the men who were enslaving them, to pick the oranges and tomatoes that you and I probably consumed that year. And we were walking through it, and it was the day that we were doing the annual Trafficking Persons Report, and I was lucky enough not only to have worked on the early cases that helped create the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, so I knew a lot of these folks. I had helped to have some of them on their walk to freedom, knew them within days of their liberation from the fields. But what struck me was my co-counsel, who is now the director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Leon Rodriguez. Leon and I were going through it together, and his two children, who were born long after we did this case, were with him. And I heard his daughter, Talia, say to Elias, look, Elias, Daddy was working on this, and this is what we were talking about at Passover. And I asked him afterwards, I said, Leon, were you guys talking about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers? Did you guys do the Haggadah supplement that Rachel Controster and the folks at Rabbis for Human Rights had done? He's like, no, we didn't do that. Literally, Talia was making the same leap into social justice at the age of 9 in explaining this to her little brother that the Jewish community as a whole has often made, that the Christian community as a whole has often made. That notion of the flight from Egypt and the notion of the enslavement of some 3,500 years ago, giving us what our marching orders are as far as the enslavement of others now. And I think that that's the thing for me, is that everything that we're trying to do is both at that bigger level of the faith group itself, whether it's Rabbis for Human Rights, whether it's the work that we're doing with the President, Secretary Kerry, the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and others. But also then it's the getting those tools out, like the slaveryfootprint.org website, which I hope that all of you have taken. If you haven't, please do. It'll answer a very uncomfortable question for you, which is how many slaves does it take to sustain the lifestyle that you are living based on what you own, what you eat, where you live, what you consume, et cetera. I certainly don't live as frugal of a life as many people in religious orders, but even my friends who are living in a convent or a monastery or in church-provided housing, when they do that, they realize that it takes a couple of dozen at a minimum to sustain the life, because we're all people who eat, we're all people who read, we're all people who carry cell phones, and I can see from the room that we're all people who wear clothes, at least today. And all of those are impacted by people who are held in forced labor around the world, 21 million. So this notion that, that it's time for a new underground railroad that Sister Marlene mentions, I think that it's the same call that Frederick Douglass made in his speech in 1867, where he basically told a group of folks who had been with him in the abolitionist struggle for religious reasons in the Northeast, in his famous Composite Nation speech in Boston, where he said, we did not, as an African American community, just go through what we went through. And we did not fight to end it so that they could turn around and do it to the Chinese, or so they could turn around and do it to the Mexicans. And the notion that the preeminent survivor, if Frederick Douglass was alive today, we would not call him an abolitionist. We would probably call him a survivor. He'd be at the Survivor Network that CAST and a number of the other NGOs are running, of people who 10 years ago were trafficking victims and now are advising the president and advising me and advising others as to what they need. But when you read what Frederick Douglass not only talked about in 1867, but what he talked about in the 1840s, about his life as a child domestic servant when he got sent up to Baltimore, it reads exactly, not just like the stories of the child domestic servants that we rescue today, but it also reads eerily similar to the descriptions of their lives of the men and women in forced prostitution in the United States and in places around the world. So that notion of this is about people. It's about every one of you thinking about how do you write about this. It's about every one of us thinking about what do we do and how can I harness that to fight human trafficking. But then it is also about every one of them. And I think that that's one of the things that I really want to kind of leave you with as far as thinking about what can the religious communities do, is to focus on the individual. You know, we say 21 million people, and we say human trafficking, we say, farm workers, and we say prostitutes, and we say all these things that end up making it so that it's not a person. And it's a lot more comfortable that way. Instead of saying, what did Brittany, or what did Evelyn, or what did Juan want? What did they expect, and what did they get instead? And then what are we going to do about it? And I think that's the thing to us. It's the priests from Apostolates of the Sea who are rowing out to those fishing boats, not because they're trying to go out and free slaves, although now it is, but they were going out to that fishing boats because they wanted to do pastoral care for men who had been at sea for 2 and 3 years at a time. And so what did the men tell them? The captain's beating us up. Those guys didn't start out to be modern abolitionists, but now you go talk to the priests that are in the Apostolate of the Sea, and they are abolitionists with a cause. And I think that's the thing. It's not just thinking about the individual person who is enslaved, but then thinking about the individual parishioner, priest, person in religious orders, person who writes about religion, everything else coming together as far as that very personal, how am I going to look at this issue, and then what am I going to do about it?
You mentioned something a minute ago that I want to push us on into the next question with, and that is talking about the ways that all of us are kind of bound up in systems that are both enabled by and enable these forms of exploitation. And I think we tend to talk about the role of religious communities in combating trafficking and alleviating its harms or addressing its harms, but I wonder if you can talk about cases that you may have seen where religion hinders the fight against trafficking or contributes to the harms of trafficking or the vulnerability of people to conditions that lead to trafficking, and religious beliefs, practices, networks. Are there ways that we need to be thinking and writing about and telling the story of religion as a contributor to this problem, as well as part of the solution?
If we want to do that just up and back kind of thing like we did before?
And I'll just say, I want us to take a few minutes to do this
yeah.
and then open it up to Q&A, but I don't want to miss this question because I actually think it's really important.
I wrestle with this a little bit. I think that one of the things is to strike the balance. There are a lot of, most of what was being written on human trafficking in the academic setting in the 1970s and 1980s was to ridicule the white slave trafficking advocacy of the turn of the last century as having been a quote-unquote moral panic. And it was a lot of feminist historians and labor historians and others. And in doing that, in no small part because it morphed over into a way to prosecute African American men for having white wives or girlfriends or prostitution involving white womanhood. But also there was kind of a little bit of a kind of post hoc ridiculing of the entire thing as though it didn't happen. And the reality is that, you know, we've seen those case files. The high volume immigrant serving prostitution in meatpacking is not simply a case like what we've seen here in Atlanta in the last couple of years with 20, 30 men a day coming to women who are in the Mexican immigrant population. 100 years ago, that was the Eastern European immigrant population, and it was 50, 30, 40, 50 men a day, et cetera. So it was real, and yet, because the unbridled enthusiasm and religious fervor of folks who wanted to be involved with this, and the not doing what, I mean, we've heard, I think, how activists who are thinking about this recognize that they need to calibrate rescue and the helping the people so that it isn't clumsily done. Not every person who's called to work on trafficking, especially through a religious motivation in the last 5 years, has put in the time and thought that you have on what that looks like. And so the first thing they want to do is say, oh, well, I fought in Iraq, and so I'm going to go and bust down doors, and I'm going to get a bunch of other special forces guys with a religious calling, and we're going to, say that we're rescuers. And they're not taking the time to get to know the legal service providers or get to know standards of care or being linked up with the nuns who've been doing this for years or even know who the domestic violence shelter operators are. They don't think about the psychological, there becomes this notion of the purity of my call to work on this is all I need. And I think that's one of the things that it undercuts the response right now. But for me, thinking about the big long-term picture, you guys can tell that I think historically as well as in the present day, because of the 13th Amendment responsibilities that I have, the thing that I worry about every day in this job is that 50 years from now, people are going to be writing about moral panic #2 and dismissing everything that we're doing on human trafficking now the way that people were dismissing the white slave trafficking panic in their minds of the turn of the last century. And I think that part of it is calibrating and figuring out how do we professionalize? How do you take that white-hot passion and call of I am called to go do this because of my faith-based tradition, and then you professionalize it, and you don't lose the reason you're doing it, but you professionalize it in a way so that this doesn't become something where everybody says 20 years from now, oh yeah, remember when we were all in our 30s and we worked on trafficking? I think that to me is the thing that we have to guard against, and I think that it's channeling the heat of that passion. I'd love to hear from folks who are actually doing that channeling. I know that, I want to say one last thing because we're going to go to Q&A. Getting everybody to still be passionate about things, but also calm down and do things well thought out is one of the things that the women religious have done very effectively over certainly the last 30 years that I've been working on, whether it's sanctuary movement, whether it's Central America, or whether it's immigration. And I think that that's one of the things that I really think about, that I've learned from the nuns, which is that kind of how do you cool off the tea, pouring it into the saucer a little bit, so that you can then really have a long-term and sustained thing. And I think that that's one of the things that ecumenicism may be able to help us with, is to tap into what we've seen from the folks in the women religious. I also want to say that because of doing this, we've introduced new lexicons into the law enforcement community, and for the first time now, you actually hear guys with badges and guns say women religious, as opposed to religious women. So we've come a long way.
Thank you very much. Sadly, I think there are some things that can inhibit the success of the work that we're trying to do. And I would, you won't be surprised to hear me say this. I think any denomination's exclusive focus on abortion, contraception, or sterilization can be inhibiting in the work. It can make it very difficult. It can turn away the victims. That's why some will say, I don't want to hear about God anymore, because your church says I am condemned. I am anathema, and there's no way for me to heal. So, Ambassador DeBaca, how you have spoken about calibrating one's response, I think is all about walking with the individuals, one by one by one, and starting with them where they are at, not with a dogma or a doctrine of any kind. Eventually, or always, we will say that those doctrines are precious, and we believe in them. But it's not how you begin. You begin with the walk. And the passionate response, the compassionate response in helping the individual step by step by step.
It's really good stuff. Just I want to echo really quickly both that the faith communities are very dangerous about getting the call and getting their sprint on, and I think it's critical when you get that call that you ask the question: is this needed? What I've been called to, is it even a need? Is anybody else already doing it? If it is a need and nobody's doing it, what can you speak into how I should do it, all you other experts in domestic violence and counseling and healthcare? And then, am I willing to put in the time and the waiting to develop that correctly so that it's not just the passion but the excellence together? So you spoke to that so well. And then this concept that faith communities are notorious for being places of judgment and condemnation. And so we as faith communities have to kind of flip our worlds upside down from the way we've kind of gotten comfortable to operating in the 20th century to say, if you walk in, I attend church at Atlanta International Church. We meet in a warehouse, and people shoot up on the street and walk in for service. Women turn a trick the night before and come to service the next morning. And that's because they know it doesn't matter how they're dressed, what they do, how they talk, what they look like, that they will be loved well. And that's what faith communities, when they're about loving well, can make such a tremendous impact, because the women expect the judgment and the eyes and the fear and the mistrust, but when you show something different, then a powerful relational connection happens that can begin the healing process. I want to say, do you need to jump in?
I just want to see if Aaliyah,
Yeah,
if you
I'm
want to
sorry.
add to this before we go to Q&A.
Oh, sure. Just very briefly, it's actually interesting that, Jeff mentioned at the very beginning that part of what got him into this is his faith. And part of actually what got me doing what I'm doing prior to working for the government, when I worked for a social service provider, I've been doing this for 10 years now, was also my faith. I am a practicing Muslim, and with that, I found that there are a lot of barriers that I faced when I was working with survivors that were of other faith-based communities other than the Christian faith-based community. That could be for several reasons. It could be that with Atlanta, that is obviously the biggest faith, so you're going to have more resources. But in terms of serving the survivors from the Jewish community, from the Muslim community, from other faith-based communities, it was an obstacle. And part of the reason why it was an obstacle was actually even recently, I had a Muslim survivor that I was working with that was actually forced into prostitution. She's actually covered, wears her hijab, and I was looking for additional resources, so naturally, I called my father up and asked him, do you still have the number for this individual? I think they've changed their phone number. And so my father shockingly said, is it a Muslim victim? And I said, well, of course, that's why I'm asking for the number. And he just sounded so shocked. And he was like, oh, was she made to work as a nanny or something, labor? And I said, no. And he said, no, it couldn't be. Sex trafficking? I said, yep. He was like, not grasping or even understanding that because she was actually very religious, that she wore her hijab, that she actually worked or was forced into prostitution. And of course, I couldn't get into the details of explaining this to my father, but this particular victim was actually not, she didn't hold on to her Muslim faith strongly until after she had been trafficked. So she was always practicing, but it wasn't until afterwards that she felt a closer connection. And so when I was reaching out to the community, I got the same reaction that I got from my father. And we were able to place her somewhere, and she lived with a family. And when the family found out what she had been engaged in, because she finally felt comfortable to, they actually kicked her out of the house. And it was so upsetting, and I felt defeated. I'm sure she obviously felt defeated because I was hoping that that support would be there. Finally, she did find that support, and it took a lot of educating and awareness. And that's not only an obstacle that I've run into with the Muslim community, it's been within the Jewish community as well. It's been within even the Christian-based community, because I've worked with a lot of Latina women that have had the same struggles just because of the fact that they were working or forced into such a heinous crime and feeling uncomfortable reaching out to the religious community because of that. And so I would say those were more of what I'm seeing. And I know that we've talked a lot about Christianity naturally just because of what the majority is here in the United States and in Atlanta. But just to tell you that it is something that, working with a lot of the immigrant and refugee communities, we do face a lot of resistance, unfortunately, from some of the other faith-based communities.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can I address one? We've all kind of made assumptions about formal religion, and I think that in trafficking cases, we often run up against indigenous religion, or religion that operates at a simultaneous level with the more mainstream religion that we might, or the person might even say that they are part of. So we had a Catholic victim a few years ago who, one of the reasons why she never left is because before they left Guatemala, he had had a bruja do a ceremony, and we actually went back during trial when suddenly this came out, and the ICE agent realized that the lock of hairs that we found when we had taken his billfold were one of the reasons why she wasn't leaving. And the Dutch have done some really innovative things right now with having traditional healers who are in the Netherlands actually do kind of reversal ceremonies for the Nigerian women who've been taken to juju doctors before they leave for Europe, because the women are convinced, even though they're also nominally Christian, they are convinced of what will happen to them if they cross the traffickers based on that ceremony. And so having something, it's a little strange to have the police agents, the detectives, taking this woman to a religious ceremony, and yet it's the thing that she needed. So part of it is listening to try to figure out if there's even a different level of religion than we're typically even looking at or what we've been talking about today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you said that. And I'll just say, I'm very conscious that mostly we have been talking about Christian institutions and communities, so I would welcome questions during the Q&A period as well that go beyond that if there's interest. And I think all of us would. So there are 2 microphones on either aisle, and we'll alternate back and forth.
Hi, I hope I can formulate this question. I'm David Schaefer with the Latin American Association, and we do a few T visas, V visas, and we've seen, over the summer, the context of the unaccompanied youth coming from Central America. And I hope my question makes sense. Jeff, I think part of this is focused on you, because I think you've made the case that, and sorry if I misstate what you said, but I think you've made the case that as a culture, we may have established the necessary and sufficient conditions for trafficking to flourish in the United States. And that sounds to me like we have a heart problem. And if it is a heart problem, I'm curious, in an environment where we have comparable values and moral relativism, one, are we going to be having a different conversation 30 years from now where it is no longer wrong to keep people in slavery? I have that fear. And 2, as a secular nonprofit in a multicultural world, in engaging the faith community, which often deals in moral absolutes, because I think that's one of the things that faith does, is it gets us in some cases to absolute truths about who God is, what He demands, what He requests. Given this very difficult value set, how are we to partner together to hold the line that trafficking was wrong, is wrong, and will always be wrong? And the reason I raise this is because we had the TVPRA on the chopping block in Congress this summer, largely because of the overwhelming number of kids, and that said to me that we weren't really serious about holding the line on trafficking, at least some of the provisions. It was really a question of how much it cost us to enforce anti-trafficking statutes. So this is my question.
Thank you.
So I'll speak to your question to me and let the experts talk about the TVPA. I think that the commonality and your fear is one that I hear a lot. Like, isn't this just getting worse? Hasn't it been getting worse? And the hypersexualization of our culture on billboards and advertising in our sitcoms, in the prevalence of pornography. I've watched the average age go from 13 to 11 to 8 of first exposure to pornography. And that is what is conditioning and teaching the whole up-and-coming generation about sex and sexuality. They're learning it before they ever hear about it at school or talk to a parent about it from pornographic video, which teaches get what you want, when you want it, how you want it. I mean, it's just a very selfish. So I think what you start to talk about is what is that feeding? And the easy response is, well, men are just sexual creatures and they have desires that need to be fulfilled. But I think the deeper thing that crosses faith lines and even secular is that human beings have a need for intimacy. And you start talking about where is the devoid of intimacy happening, and you can talk about breakdown of family, but what am I feeding with pornography, which leads to prostitution potentially, not in all cases, but rarely do you see prostitution or sex trafficking buyers where they didn't start there. So what are they missing? What's lacking in them that they're doing this? What is it fulfilling? And what I would say the commonality is intimacy. So how do you start to have healthy conversation about true intimacy and not one-way selfish, just about me concepts of intimacy? I don't know if that answers your question.
On the TVPA, I think that those nervous couple of weeks as far as whether it was on the chopping block or not, I actually kind of see it from the other direction, which is that it did not get chopped. And that shows, given how white-hot the rhetoric around the kids in the border was, even in the Republican conference, that folks remembered the values that they had voted on in 2008 in setting that scheme up. They listened to people like Michael Hill from U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and others who were up on the Hill making that case. It was a real full court press by the faith community, by the trafficking community, by the immigrant community, and it did remind the members of Congress who had crossed political boundaries back in 2008 to vote for this. I think it reminded them of why they did. And by the end of that couple of weeks, you didn't see the TVPA on the chopping block anymore, and I think that says an awful lot.
Thanks.
Sister Marlene, this isn't a homey question, but it hits home with this group who's staying in a hotel and who once a year chooses a different hotel to stay in. Can you tell us how your program to get thousands of conventions to stay in hotels where the staff has been trained to look for, specially trained to look for victims of human trafficking? How is that going? You've been doing it for, what, 6 or 7 years?
Well, we hire a group of women who have formed a nonprofit agency to run our conferences for us. And they have taken on the cause of human trafficking and formed a corporation of their own that focuses primarily on human trafficking and ways that they as a corporation can make an impact. And so they, whenever they work for any group, they go to the hotel managers and ask them if, simply if they have signed the EPCOT agreement or if they will sign it. And then because they are working with thousands of conferences and people who do not want to be in hotels unless that has happened. And they will refuse any hotel. And the Conference of Women Religious, for example, we just simply refuse to have a conference in any hotel that has not signed that agreement and worked with that. I think, first of all, you have to convince the leaders of the conference that this is important. You know, I think it became public just recently, for example, that even our U.S. Catholic bishops were holding their annual conference in a hotel that had not signed the EPCOT agreement, but they were not using Kimberly Ritter and her organization to make their arrangements for them. So, you know, there's a whole nother level of raising awareness. And the hotels who have agreed to do this, for example, Radisson internationally, has taken on the obligation and responsibility to do that for every single Radisson hotel that's run in the world. So
Do you know of any stories where, I understand that it has happened, where the front desk or someone, maybe a housekeeper, more likely a housekeeper, these people go directly to the room, but they've called and these people, often minors, have been rescued? I mean, do you hear these stories?
Yes, we do hear these stories.
Hello. Thanks for being here. This question is mostly for Jeff, I think your name is, but anybody who wants to address it. I'm Dave Moscato, I'm the Public Relations Director for American Atheists. I'd like to hear more about what you think of the negative influences of religion on sex trafficking and about shifting toward being sex positive. Do you think the demand for sex with victims of sex trafficking would go down if it weren't for the Judeo-Christian values of slut-shaming, the idea that sex is only permissible within a monogamous marriage, that masturbation and sexual fetishes are shameful, and so on? And if sex work were legal and regulated instead of seen as shameful, do you think that would help move the demand to consenting sex workers instead of victims of sex trafficking?
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. This is what I'll say. I think that these concepts that things like slut shaming are Judeo-Christian values isn't true. There's nothing in the Bible that I read where Jesus shames In fact, he was one of the first religious leaders of his time to really dignify women, and particularly women in prostitution. So even though, yes, that is happening, I would say that's a perversion of the purity of Judeo-Christian values. And I would say, and in regard to sex positive, we in our organization do not have a negative view of sex. We think sex is a beautiful thing, and we don't think that it is the only value that a human being represents to another human being, which is what, when you get to prostitution and trafficking, essentially is all you're good for is for 30 minutes or 15 minutes satisfying my sexual desire, that actually demeans sex and the other individual. And so with legalizing prostitution, we hear this a lot. We are opposed to it because we look at Amsterdam, and the idea there was if we legalize prostitution, then we can regulate it better and it'll be a safer environment for the women. And what's happened is it's rolled out a doormat for pimps and traffickers to bring women who don't speak the language and teach them how to say the right things if they're asked certain questions. And they've actually, I think it was the mayor said, the experiment of legalized prostitution has utterly failed. And now we're just rampant with organized crime and mafia and trafficking-driven prostitution. And so we don't think that is the healthiest answer to the problem of trafficking. We think that the Nordic model, if you're familiar with that at all, in Sweden, I won't go all the way down that road, but just personally, that's a more effective model where you don't criminalize the women, but where you're encouraging within the culture and the legal system men to find other healthy ways to explore and satisfy their sexuality than to go pay for it from another human being. I appreciate the question. Hopefully I answered it, yeah.
Does anybody else want to speak to that?
Yeah, if I could. I think one of the things to remember, and when you look at Northern Europe especially, is that there are multiple jurisdictions that have multiple ways that they've tried to regulate prostitution, and every one of them has a trafficking problem. The Nordics have a trafficking problem. The Germanic countries have a trafficking problem. The French model has trafficking problems. The common law countries have trafficking problems. I think that it shows that regardless of how one regulates prostitution, one has to be vigilant. And I spent 3 hours yesterday with the Dutch delegation, and one of the things that they were most excited on is their close partnership and working relationship with the Swedes, including exchanges of staff. And these are two countries that have very different underlying assumptions in their prostitution regulation law, and yet their trafficking laws are such common assumptions as far as enslavement and as far as trying to help people out that they are able to work together. And I think that to me is one of the things that really tells me that when we look at 190 plus countries around the world, it is very interesting as to how everybody's doing things, but New Zealand, which went with a full-on legalization thing, they might call it something different when you meet with the prostitutes union. What they will say is, we are concerned that some of our members are being beaten up by their bosses. That sounds a lot to me as somebody who fights trafficking, like somebody saying there's sex trafficking in New Zealand, even though their way of looking at it was, oh, if we legalize, then we won't have sex trafficking. Then you go to a place like the United States where prostitution is illegal, and we have a trafficking problem. So, I think that's one of the things is we have to look, if you have humans in your country, you're going to have a trafficking problem, and then it's a matter of how do you go out, and how do you also bridge the gap so that we don't get so divided over some of those other policies.
I'm Peter Smith with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. This pertains more to labor trafficking. Where is the dividing line between clear cases of forced labor and cases where in our economy we have people who take very difficult, dangerous jobs out of desperation? People working in food processing, mining, some areas where if they had any choice economically, they would work anywhere else. And especially given, the word coercion, the third part of the possible definitions of trafficking where does coercion come into play when you have an employer that might just take advantage of, say, an immigrant population so desperate for work that they'll do something very dangerous?
Thank you.
You know, I think we'll do the quick definitional thing real quick. Under U.S. federal law and under most of the laws in the world, what you're looking at is their inability to leave. And that inability to leave needs to be predicated on something that the boss did. Now, it could be the boss is taking advantage of a structural thing, and so there have been cases done in the United States where that structural thing is literally the truth is being told to the worker, which is if you run away and the Immigration Service gets you, they're going to throw you in jail and deport you. Well, that boss is telling the truth, but so too is a blackmailer. If the blackmailer comes to you and says, you robbed that bank and I know you robbed that bank and so you have to start paying me money, they are telling the truth about you robbing the bank and that you could get in trouble, but they're doing it for an improper purpose. And so if you look, for instance, at a phenomenal case that was done up in New Hampshire a few years ago with these big, strong Jamaican men in a tree service, lumberjacks, basically, the biggest threat was they were telling them the truth, which is if the Immigration Service catches you, they'll throw you in jail. And then the court upheld the conviction saying that might be true, yet the boss is misusing it. And so what you always look for in the investigations is the boss misusing something that's structural? So that structural thing that's holding them in servitude could be a drug addiction. It could be the fact they were being raped by their uncle or their stepfather or something like that, which is kind of the stereotype, but very true in a lot of the child sex trafficking cases. So I think that's one of the things you always have to look at is kind of what's structural and deterministic. Being trapped in a bad situation or being an immigrant doing a job that others don't want or being a member of a minority community here in the U.S. doing a job that others don't want isn't necessarily going to be enough, but then if it's that the boss is taking advantage of that situation such that you have no reasonable alternative but to continue the service. And that's where you're looking at. That's what the juries have to decide is, was there a reasonable alternative to continuing to serve this particular master? And was that overborne through some force and coercion on the part of the manipulative boss?
And just to add to that, we collaborate and partner up with Department of Labor as well with a lot of our labor cases. So that way we can take one angle while they take another. And if it doesn't appear to be a labor trafficking situation because there's not necessarily the clear-cut, force, fraud, or coercion, then the Department of Labor might be able to do something with it. We've worked a lot with the Wage and Hour Division, and they've gone in and conducted their own investigations. And, some of these individuals that may be exploited to a certain degree, but I guess it wouldn't fit the federal definition, they're still able to receive some other types of services that the Department of Labor might be able to offer.
Thanks. I think this will be the last question over here.
That's a lot of pressure. Hi, Menachem Wecker. I'm a freelancer in Washington, D.C. We've heard a little bit about the Passover Exodus story being, I think the term that was used was marching orders for us, and we've heard about doctrinal examples that uphold the idea of human dignity, but we're all on a beat where in the first few hours you learn that scriptures are so vast and so detailed that you could cherry pick your lifestyle anywhere from St. Francis to a televangelist and in between. And so why are we not hearing, as we're hearing about Judeo-Christian values in this regard, why aren't we talking about all of the examples in the Old Testament and as well in the Quran about that not only upholds slavery, but probably defined a whole lot of the slave trade at the time. If we start looking at the ages of some of the few female figures that appear in these faith traditions, we're going to find that, according to rabbinic tradition, Rebecca was 3 years old, things of that sort. So are we not discussing this because people think of these as outdated? I'm just curious why that's not something that's come up as we're discussing potentially areas where faith traditions might be harming rather than healing. Thank you.
I think that one of the things that we're really trying to crunch in the and not necessarily it's the United States government, although we're trying to help with this conversation. I think if you look at the Second Vatican Conference, for instance, the theology that's been done around forced labor, the theology that's been done around slavery in the last 50 years, certainly has looked at that. I'm not sure if theologians in other faiths have put a lot of the same energy into it, and that's one of the things that makes us so excited about the new Global Freedom Network that the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury are getting a lot of credit for. But what people are forgetting is the third member of that, which is the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which is really one of the leading theology shops, as it were, in the Muslim world. And I think that is a place, a lot of attention in the last year or so as very fundamentalist groups, whether it's ISIL or Boko Haram, are reviving things that are not necessarily in mainstream Islam as far as justifications. We were talking just before the panel about some of this in both the Judeo-Christian scriptures and then also in the Quran. A lot of the things about treatment of slaves are kind of regulating it, but not questioning whether or not slavery exists. And Christianity really started questioning whether slavery should exist only in the last 230 or 40 years. Even the Roman Catholics who were questioning that in the 1500s, whether it's De las Casas or others, they were mainly looking at kind of conditions and don't mistreat the Indians and this and that. But that assumption that slavery was just part of kind of society was, I think, reflected in the scriptures from thousands of years ago. I think that a lot of that hard theological work that's been done is starting to be done now in some of the other faith traditions. But I do think that it's something that we need to encourage so that we're out there on the front lines, so that the folks, whether it's somebody like the Apostles of the Sea, whether it's others, are out there doing that kind of hands-on work. But the theologians need to be back at headquarters doing that kind of work as well, because I do think that there are unresolved issues. Speaking from the laity, the United States government is trying to support that, but clearly, we are only, I think, one voice as we're trying to encourage that kind of thought, especially in the Islamic scholarship.
I'm going to force my way in for a minute.
Okay, quickly.
If that's okay. So I think for folks who have a personal faith that approach this issue, and I know I was quoting parts of Scripture, so I'm sure part of that question was directed to me. For me, the Scripture is about looking at what is the character of the God who I serve. And all through Scripture, there's narratives of people groups who did things, of institutions that existed. But what I'm always looking for is, what is God's heart or his character toward those things? So the Exodus story, what stands out to me as a marching order is it says God heard the cries of the afflicted and he determined to act on their behalf. And then when people who are like King David, we're told, was a man after God's own heart, but he killed a man and stole his wife. Well, that wasn't consistent with God's plan, and God rebuked him for that. And so what I'm looking at through the God of the Old and New Testament and the person of Jesus is, what is God's character? He is just. He is for the afflicted. He is for the oppressed. He's for the widow and the orphan. That's where I get my marching cry, not through the narratives of what was happening, what the institutions were, but who is this God that I've surrendered my life to, and what is his desire for healthy living and for godly living to look like? And so for me, that's where it's the extension of my understanding of Scripture, not so much of cherry picking, but what do I draw from Scripture as to the character of God toward those who we're talking about on this panel?
Thanks. And I'll actually just end with a moment of the moderator's privilege in response to your question to say that there's actually an excellent collection of essays and I did not come with the title written down, but it's published, it came out of a conference that was hosted at Brandeis. And it's a collection of essays by scholars of scripture and theology from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions about those kinds of difficult texts that endorse slavery as a matter of course in human society. And it's a historical look at those texts and how communities have interpreted them over time and how interpretation has changed over time, which it obviously is a malleable practice, that interpretation. But find me afterwards and I can give you the title if you're interested.
Email it to me as well.
I'll be glad to do it. Thank you so much. I hope you'll share a round of applause with me for our panelists and this fantastic discussion.